Mayor Wilson is coming.
All right. All right, should I give the 30-second warning? All right, 30-second warning. Grab your taco bowls. Oh, okay, great. Mayor Jordan and Mayor Wilson. All right, good afternoon, everyone. I would like to call to order this meeting of the COG Board of, and welcome everyone to our February meeting. I'm glad to see everyone in person today, and we noted in our last meeting in January, we're doing this one again in person so that we can welcome our Executive Director, Clark Mercer. And next month, in March, we will be back in virtual. So before we begin our meeting today, please rise and we will do the Pledge of Allegiance. Thank you, everyone. So as a reminder, our meetings are audio and video recorded and being live streamed as well on the COG website through COG's YouTube account. I have one announcement today. On February 17th, COG will be hosting an event, Fighting Hate for Good, How to Speak Up Against the Rising Tide of Anti-Semitism, Hate, and Extremism. All of you should have received a calendar invite for that virtual briefing. We will be joined to learn more from ADL Regional Director Meredith Weisel about the increase in overall hate and bias incidents and what we can do together to combat this in our communities. So I hope you all can join us for that. In addition, I wanted to see if we had any new members who were joining us today and from last week, and I don't believe so. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our Executive Director and welcome Mr. Mercer.
Thank you, Chair Stewart. This is exciting to be here for my first meeting, and I will probably trespass on your time by an extra minute or two today because I wanted to share some initial feedback and thoughts, but I'm very excited to be here and grateful for the kind welcome. So just over the last several weeks, board members and staff have been gracious with their time to help me get my sea legs under me, and I would be remiss if I did not point out Chuck Bean specifically. The way he handled this transition was just first class and incredibly helpful, so I'm very grateful for that. And over the coming weeks, next couple of months, I look forward to coming out to your jurisdiction, your county, your city, your town, and meeting one-on-one with you. I'd like to understand better your role within COG, your thoughts, your feedback. I've got pretty thick skin from previous jobs, both in Richmond and in D.C., so constructive feedback is welcome. What are we doing well that we need to continue, and where there are opportunities for COG to improve? I want to highlight, and we'll do this each month, just a couple of highlights from staff's work over the previous few weeks. And I want to jump right in and recognize Jeff King and the Climate and Energy team. They held a symposium of sorts at the auto show on electric vehicles and charging stations, and it was really quite engaging. You also got a free pass to go to the auto show, so I think that helped with attendance. But Jeff's remarks and his thoughts appeared in the Washington Post, and a copy of that is in your packet, so please take a look at that. But a lot of good questions on who's going to own these charging stations, where they should go, the equity on where they're placed throughout our communities. Last meeting, you received an overview on homelessness in the region. Hillary Chapman and her housing team then helped conduct the point-in-time survey a few weeks ago, and we've also in coordination with 8 jurisdictions, released the draft regional fair housing plan for public review and comment. And that's the first time in 25 years that the region has worked together on a fair housing plan to help prevent and end housing discrimination. So the public comment period is open until March 31st. Getting up to speed on the number of meetings that COG hosts. It's impressive, I got to tell you, a lot of committees, a lot of good meetings, but wanted to give a couple folks shout-outs. Laritza Fitzhugh at our Office of Human Resource Management. She helps coordinate with the George Washington University, the Institute for Regional Excellence, and they had their 19th cohort kickoff here a few weeks ago, and those are leaders from your jurisdictions participating in that program. Scott Boggs and his Homeland Security and Public Safety team. I learn each day of a new program that team offers the region. One of those is convening all of our police chiefs across the region. And to walk in last week to a meeting with police chiefs from the region, state troopers from the 3 states, and our new Capitol Hill police chief talking about coordination, was a good reminder of why I'm so excited to be here. So congratulations to Scott. And then lastly, I don't know if you all have the podcast looked up in your cars, but Chair Stewart had a great interview with Bob McCartney on regional priorities, so give that a listen. And switching gears, I'd like to give a couple quick pieces of feedback and thoughts for my role, COG, as we move forward. One, throughout the interview process, it was clear to me how valuable the staff are to the board members and to the region. That came across from each of you during the interview process. And so I have a commitment to sit down over the coming weeks with every one of our staff members, hear a little bit more about what they do and how I can support them. We have a seasoned staff of folks that have a lot of years of experience in this region. We also have younger staff, and particularly, and we'll talk a little bit more about the hybrid nature of work in a moment, but particularly in this new hybrid nature of work, how do we provide opportunities for mentorship and professional development? I think I need to be pretty intentional about that as I take on this role. We had an all-staff luncheon last week here in this conference room. It was the first time since 2019 that the staff gathered together in person, and the feedback was really positive. So working with the HR team and the different department heads, trying to think of other opportunities to get the staff together in person is going to be a priority moving forward. Extra duties as assigned. I have learned I am on the CPAS committee, right? So there's 3 owners of this office building, and there are going to be some discussions that I need to have with the Budget and Finance Committee over the next few months about what the future of this space looks like. And I'm also chair of the Pension Committee, so a lot of folks have checked in. I'm not going to recommend we invest in Bitcoin or anything. I had to allay fears early on, but getting up to speed on those things. Board initiatives. So Chair Stewart and I met 2 weeks ago to talk about board initiatives for the year. And I guess my approach, a couple of things I would just note. Obviously, it's great to have consensus amongst board members on issues, and we work behind the scenes to try to mitigate any issues that might pop up. That being said, when you look at Region Forward and Region United, there's some tough issues that this region faces, and I think healthy debate discussion is a good thing. So don't always expect for there to be unanimous votes, don't want meetings to get out of hand, but do want to tackle tough and important issues. On Region United, Region Forward, I'm trying to get a better handle, just so you know, on what our goals are, what the assumptions were that went into establishing those goals, and then assessing where we are in meeting them. It's always good to take a step back and see if those assumptions still hold true. The region has gone through tremendous change over the last 3 years with how we work, how we commute, and I think it's worth thinking about that as we look at our housing goals and transit goals and getting up to speed on those. Outside of Region United, Chair Stewart and I talked about a handful of issues where we will, as a staff, think about if and how COG could engage. But one of the consistent pieces of feedback that I received when I was in the interview process and talking to board members is, how can COG be more proactive in identifying issues that this region will face as opposed to reactive? Are there issues that we know are on the cusp that need to be addressed regionally where COG could play a role? So a few of those issues that we discussed involve WMATA and the Safety Commission, what role, if any, COG could play in helping those two entities move forward. Economic development, clearly we've got tremendous economic development authorities, but is there a role for COG to play in letting our would-be employers and current employers know what this region values in good neighbors, good corporate neighbors. The chair mentioned the rise in anti-Semitism, and we will have opportunities for COG board members to hear from some experts, and that's unfortunately not isolated incidents, but across the region and the country right now. Workforce development in our community college systems, where the jobs are, where we need the jobs to be. Thinking if there's a role for COG to play there. Crime rates and violence across the region. Obviously, that's a pretty weighty issue. In addition, mental health, both where we have tremendous knowledge and expertise on the board. But is there a role for COG to play? I would say in both. The answer is yes, but we need to figure out what that looks like and how we can be constructive when we bring those issues up to the board. And then the last issue that I would just flag, where it's one that I do think is in COG's wheelhouse, is the hybrid nature of work right now, and particularly the federal government's posture. And too often when that topic comes up, it's all about the pros and cons of hybrid work, which we could talk for days about, and it's fascinating. There's certainly tremendous pros, and there are some challenges. But what I think COG needs to think about is what we can do to be a good partner to the district and the mayor and council as they try to get the Biden administration's attention to think this through with them. And that work from home posture is having an impact on where people are living, where they're buying homes, how they're commuting. And I think it is underestimated just what a tremendous impact it is currently having and will have. And I've been involved in the past on base realignment and closure commission decisions by the federal government. And when a base is perhaps going to be closed in a community, that community gets several years advance notice. And if it goes through and it is closed, there's an expectation that the federal government provide assistance to that community so it can kind of figure out what it wants to be post-base closure. And I would just offer that 200,000 employees on a hybrid work environment is dozens and dozens of BRAC closures a day in the district. And we need to think through constructively how we can assist the district, but also there's plenty of federal installations in your districts and federal workers as we grapple with this. So as we kind of look at the assumptions that went into some of our goals for Region Forward, I think we need to realize we're in a bit of a post-pandemic environment, and hybrid is some degree of hybrid is going to be the new normal, and we need to plan for that. So I apologize if I went a few minutes over, but wanted to give you a bit of a flavor for what I hope to bring to COG, and I'm grateful to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mercer. We're going to have some year together, so thank you for laying out all of that. We'll now move on to the next item on our agenda. Are there any amendments to today's agenda? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to approval of the minutes from January 11th. Is there a motion and a second to approve the minutes from the January 11th board meeting?
Approval, Madam Chair.
Second.
Second.
Supervisor Gross moved, and I'm going to take someone virtually, and I think Supervisor Bailey. Yep, Supervisor Bailey seconded. Any comments or changes to the minutes? All right, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed?
Aye.
Any abstaining? All right, thank you. Our minutes have passed, and now we will move on to our next agenda item, which is our consent agenda. We have one resolution on the consent agenda today authorizing phase 38 of COG's Continuous Airport System Planning Program. This can be reviewed on page 17 of your board packet. And is there a motion and a second to approve the consent agenda?
Approval, Madam Chairman.
Councilmember Moore moved it, and I have Vice Chair Lux seconded it. All those in favor of the consent agenda, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstaining? All right, hearing none, the consent agenda passes. All right, we're moving along. Item number 7, our fiscal year 2023 second quarter financial report. For our next item, I'm going to turn it over to COG's Corporate Secretary Treasurer, Mayor Michael O'Connor, as well as our CFO, Julie Muskog, to present the fiscal year 2023 second quarter financial report. Mayor O'Connor.
Thank you, Chair Stewart, members of the board. It's an honor to be here in this capacity today as your Secretary Treasurer. I appreciate the confidence that you've bestowed in me in giving me this opportunity, but I'll be quite honest with you, Julie makes it very easy for anybody who sits in this seat. So please don't be afraid. If the opportunity presents itself to you in the future to be the Secretary Treasurer, it's a great position to be in. You have the Quarter 2 financial report for fiscal year 2023 in your board packet starting on page 18 showing the results of the quarter that ended December 31st. This is an interim unaudited report prepared by management. I've reviewed this information with Ms. Muskog and will turn it now over to her to answer all of the hard questions.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Operating revenue and expenses are tracking lower to the FY23 budget at 41%, but this is about at the mid-year total for the prior year. Revenues are generally higher in the second half of the fiscal year, so this is in large part a timing issue, and we do expect to track closer to the FY23 budget by year end. Lower federal and state revenue year to date in the budget is driven by lower spend in Transportation Planning Board Work Program and Commuter Connections. These are both cost reimbursable projects, so the year-to-date expenses are also lower than budget. Also, both of these projects tend to spend a lot more in the second half of the year, so that's why we expect to track closer to budget in the second half. As of the end of Q2, we have a surplus of $1.3 million in designated program fund balance. The Housing Affordability Planning Program, the grant from Amazon, and several water and air programs are driving this increase in restricted project funds. This is once again a timing issue where we've received funds in advance of the program spend and expect that they'll be spent over time. The increase in undesignated funds are a result of higher revenues than budgeted in the Cooperative Purchasing Program and the REIT dividend from the ownership of this building. Some very good news is the Cooperative Purchasing Program has already generated $345,000 in revenue so far this year, and for the third year in a row will not need any subsidy from COG general funds. It will, in fact, be able to generate general funds for COG after expenses. This is the first time at the mid-year mark that this has happened in the program history. Another variance is in the statement of revenue, expense, and change in net position is in subrecipient pass-through funds, which are at 29% of the amount budgeted. A significant portion of the subrecipient pass-through funds budgeted for enhanced mobility projects have not yet been recognized, but are expected to achieve budget by the end of the year. This is comparable to where we were also in FY22. The statement of net position as of December 31, 2022 shows an overall increase in net position of $2.4 million, and this increase reflects the impact of the increase year over year in the restricted and unrestricted project fund balances. Overall, COG remains financially healthy and board designated reserve funds are at 100%, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have at this point.
Great, thank you very much for that, and again, for all the excellent work that you do, Ms. And I will see if there are any questions or comments from the board. All right, seeing none in the room, are there any virtually?
None, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Supervisor Bailey. All right, I'm seeing no comments. You all just did a wonderful, excellent job, and it's always good to hear that our revenues are increasing in some areas. So,
very good news. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to take this moment to welcome a new member of the board, Council Vice Chair Blege. Thank you for joining us, for being here today. We're glad you're here. And we're bringing up now our next panel of folks to talk about accelerating action on transit-oriented communities. That's our next item. And we will be discussing and learning how we can continue to accelerate action on our Region United Planning Framework in the area of high-capacity transit station areas. We have COG's Transportation Planning and Research Program Director will brief us on HCTs in the region and opportunities to develop and promote transit-oriented communities. Before we hear from him, I'm going to turn it over to COG's Deputy Executive Director of Metropolitan Planning to set the stage for the next few agenda items on how we can continue to accelerate action and develop implementation ideas to meet the goals in the Region United Planning Framework. And so I will turn it over to Conte. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. And members of the board are aware that this board has adopted several regional goals and identified a set of priorities to achieve our aspirations for a more equitable, prosperous, accessible, livable, and sustainable region. Members have been taking actions at the local and also at the regional level towards achieving these goals and advancing these priorities. One of the themes, as Chair noted, for COG board meetings this year is accelerating the actions that are being contemplated and taken to achieve these goals. So in today's meeting, the next 3 items of the agenda, members will receive a status of where the region stands today on 3 such goals and priority areas, building on the actions that you all have taken. And those 3 items are building transit-oriented communities around the high-capacity transit stations that we anticipate being in this region by 2030, in the next 7 years. Also providing adequate and affordable housing in regional activity centers and near these high-capacity transit station areas. That's the second regional goal. And the third one is really addressing the unacceptable level of fatalities and serious injury crashes on our roadways. So actions are being taken on these fronts, but how can we accelerate them? So the purpose of the briefing is really to promote a discussion about what can be done at the regional level to accelerate actions to address these issues. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Tim Kanan.
Thank you, Conti. Thank you, Chair Stewart and members of the board. It's nice to be here before you in person. I've grown used to presenting to you in a WebEx format, so this is kind of unusual for me to see you in 3D, but it's exciting to be here. Last year, the COG published Region United Metropolitan Planning Framework for 2030, and that set the board's planning priorities for the next decade related to equity, transit and land use, climate change, built upon 4 key priorities that Conti touched on. Equity emphasis areas, or EEAs. I apologize in advance for the number of acronyms I'm going to use in this presentation. High capacity transit station areas, or HCTs, the 2030 housing targets, and the 2030 greenhouse gas reduction goals. This presentation will focus on the HCTs, or the high capacity transit, understanding what we have observed and where we believe we may be headed to inform your discussion on how we might accelerate action to further optimize high-capacity transit to achieve our regional objectives. So why high-capacity transit? The board has identified building successful transit-oriented communities, or TOCs, throughout the region as a priority. And high-capacity transit stations provide the core transit infrastructure that can be used to cultivate healthy TOCs. Transit-oriented communities are more than just development. They are communities comprising a mix of land uses and mixed-income neighborhoods. They effectively accommodate growth and support sustainable and equitable economic development. They advance regional housing targets. They maximize return on infrastructure investment. And TOCs help achieve regional greenhouse gas reduction and air quality goals. So a little bit about what are high-capacity transit, or HCTs. And quite simply, there are areas, existing or planned locations around 5 principal transit types: Metro Rail, Commuter Rail, which in this region is MARC or VRE, Light Rail, Bus Rapid Transit or BRT, and Streetcar. And the map provides a general location of all the high-capacity transit that we anticipate to be in place by 2030. So transit-oriented communities, or the communities surrounding HCTs in many cases, leverage the region's significant investment in transit. They provide housing at all income levels and family and household sizes. They expand economic development opportunities for both employers and employees by locating jobs and people closer together, which is a priority that we aspire to here in this region. They provide affordable and environmentally friendly travel options, as well as housing and work sites that use less energy. So what does optimizing high-capacity transit station areas really mean? It means maximizing return on policy and infrastructure investments, advancing multiple regional goals like equitable and affordable mobility and accessibility to all, bringing jobs and housing closer together by using land more efficiently and providing a variety of activities and options, jobs, housing, shopping, entertainment, healthcare, the whole spectrum, reducing greenhouse gas emissions and improving air quality and providing mobility for all. So in general, this slide really shows kind of a generalized pattern of what a transit-oriented community might look like from a conceptual standpoint. It shows concentric circles and represents the half-mile area around the areas where healthy TOCs can be supported. Note that some HCT stations, I think I skipped part of my notes, excuse me. So they have ACT stations at the core, which is surrounded by varying land use types and intensities that accommodate varying community activities. Healthy TOCs provide infrastructure and services for residents, workers, and visitors alike to access and make better use of the transit within that transit-oriented community. This conceptual concentric circles imply varying mixes of land and activities, as well as transit accessibility options that might be provided. So having set the context for TOCs and high-capacity transit that serves the transit-oriented communities, I would like to provide some facts about them in our region. In terms of land area, the map shows selected high-capacity transit station nodes, and the circle around them represent the half-mile around these stations where healthy TOCs can be supported. Note that some high-capacity transit station areas overlap with one another and share the same area. In 2020, high-capacity transit areas included only 3% of the region's land area. In the 10 years leading up to 2030, as new transit service comes online, this will increase to just over 5%, a very small amount of land compared to the entire region. So what's happening in that small amount of land? In terms of jobs and population, by 2030, nearly half the region's jobs will be located within a half-mile of the region's high-capacity transit stations. Between 2020 and 2030, jobs in high-capacity transit station areas will have increased 12%. However, the number of residents in these same areas will increase by more than 50%. All that comes together in this illustration of the previous land area and the jobs and households data, and it shows the areas in blue in each pie chart represents the high-capacity transit station areas, and the areas in orange are all the other places within the region. And we see in terms of jobs, by 2030, nearly half of the jobs in the entire region will be located within high-capacity transit station areas. In terms of residents, we see a lot of growth occurring within ACTs as well. So we see the emergence of these transit-oriented communities where jobs and workers and residents are coming closer together in these areas. And the remarkable part about this chart is that all of that activity is occurring in the very, very narrow slice of this pie, which is the land area comprised by high-capacity transit. By 2030, that will only be about 6% of the land area. In terms of equity emphasis areas, I didn't want to miss a chance to tie this to equity and how we consider equity in all that we do. And it's important that we note that within the high-capacity transit station areas in 2020, 45% of all the EEAs or equity emphasis areas were located either wholly or partially within areas served by high-capacity transit. By 2030, nearly 60% of EEAs will be within proximity to high-capacity transit. This is important as it shows, in general, at the regional level, that more travel options are becoming available to communities with higher concentrations of persons of color or persons with lower income. These next two slides show jobs to household ratios for the round 9.2 cooperative forecast. Just a little note on what jobs to household ratios are, and it essentially is the number of jobs in an area divided by the number of households in that same area. So if a ratio increases from one time to a point in the future, it means that the number of jobs are increasing faster than the number of households. Conversely, if it decreases, it means the number of households is increasing faster than the number of jobs in that area. It's important to look at both the ratio itself, the number itself, as well as how that ratio is changing over time. In this chart, this slide compares and contrasts the household ratio, jobs to household ratios in the total region, the area of the region that is served by high-capacity transit, as well as the high-capacity transit station areas that are in the east versus the west. Between 2020 and 2030, the ratio decreases from 3.14 to 2.69 in high-capacity transit areas in the region. This means that the number of households is growing faster, and these areas are, and often these areas are areas that are already employment centers. So adding more housing in these areas does bring jobs and housing closer together, as this region aspires to do. The relative growth in housing compared to jobs was more pronounced in high-capacity transit station areas in the western part of the region than in the east. Looking at this same data from a different geographic lens, looking at the regional core, which is the District of Columbia, Arlington County, and the city of Alexandria, inner suburbs, which is our larger beltway-oriented jurisdictions, Fairfax County, Montgomery County, Prince George's County, and the independent cities and municipalities contained within them, and then the outer suburbs, which are beyond that, Loudoun County, Prince William County, Frederick County, Charles County. Looking at those, we see between 2020 and 2030, the number of households grow faster relative to the number of jobs in high-capacity transit station areas in the regional core and in the inner suburbs. But by contrast, the number of jobs grew faster relative to the number of households in high-capacity transit station areas in the outer suburbs. So I'd like to talk a little bit about some examples of actions that have been taken to accelerate our optimization of high-capacity transit in the region. And this is by no means intended to be an exhaustive list of examples, but I think they're good examples of how we've accelerated action in this area. The Loudoun County's 2019 Comprehensive Plan. It was prepared as the county was anticipating the Metro Rail Silver Line Phase 2 to come online. There are 2 new stations that were going to serve the county, as well as an additional station at the airport itself. And the comprehensive plan developed new land use designations to accommodate higher density mixed-use development in areas served by these new Metro Rail stations to support the development of healthy transit-oriented communities. And for the first time in its history, Loudoun County has an urban area land use designation in the county's comprehensive plan. In Prince George's County, Maryland, the Blue Line Corridor. This is the county's economic development platform that promotes the areas served by the 4 Blue Line stations in the county as a transit-oriented community corridor with dense, multimodal, amenity-rich sports and entertainment destination through actions that can catalyze development and creating jobs. In Fairfax County, Embark Richmond Highway, the county is making a significant investment in bus rapid transit that serves the US 1 Richmond Highway corridor in the South County. And to plan for this, the county is making significant changes to its land use plan and zoning to support the development of healthy and vibrant transit-oriented communities in the corridor through its Embark Richmond Highway planning initiative. And of course, as I mentioned, these are not, there are more examples. However, these are intended to provide sort of a flavor of what can be done. So the data I've shown on where we have been and the direction we are headed as the region continues to emerge from the post-pandemic into the post-pandemic period, there are opportunities that we can do more. It shows opportunities where we performed as well as opportunities that we can do more. And I'm going to conclude my presentation briefly to give you more of an opportunity to discuss this among yourselves as board members. What we can do as a region, we can consider some questions as we do that. How do we consider prioritizing high-capacity transit in local land use and transportation decision-making? For example, adding more housing that is affordable to all near high-capacity transit stations, or prioritizing projects that improve non-motorized access to stations. How can the region continue to plan for and deliver equitable transit service to transit-oriented communities as development patterns and activities continue to evolve in the post-pandemic era? And finally, what other actions can be taken to accelerate building transit-oriented communities around high-capacity transit? These are a few questions that might be considered as you discuss this important topic. I'll conclude my presentation here so you can discuss this. Thank you, Chair Stewart and members of the board.
Thank you very much for that presentation. I'll kick us off, and I have one question. When you talked about the jobs to household ratio on slide, I think it was 12 and 13, do you know, have you looked at, is there a sweet spot we should be sort of aiming towards in the region?
1.54 poll?
Yeah.
I actually know the answer to that.
Okay.
When we did the Long Range Plan Task Force, which was a TPB initiative, we looked at some of these scenarios in which we could find that sweet spot, and we identified sort of the optimal would be 1.54, and region-wide we're closer to that, but within the high-capacity transit, we've seen a lot more job development in general. There are other areas within the region where jobs growth is lagging behind residential growth, and we're trying to bring those more in balance. But as we've seen in the high-capacity transit, the jobs outnumber the household in a way where that ratio is higher than 1.54. So we do want to see that come more in balance, whether it's by providing more households and therefore residents and workers in an area, or in some cases, if there's been more residential development and that jobs to household ratio for a particular station might be out of whack from a standpoint that is too low, adding jobs in those areas.
Great, thank you. I believe Council President Evan Glass has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One of the slides talked about the equity emphasis areas, and I'm just looking at my notes that by 2030, it's expected or projected that 59%, is that right? Yeah, I'm not wearing my glasses. So 59% 59% of the HCTs will be in equity emphasis areas, or 59% of equity emphasis areas will be HCTs? That's my first clarification.
It's the latter. It's
the latter.
59% of equity emphasis areas will be either within HCTs or will at least touch them in some manner.
Right. And so that assumes that those equity emphasis areas will remain, right, as they are now, and that the residents in those areas will be able to remain there as well. And so clearly the question and big issue to deal with is displacement. As you know, I'm sitting with my Prince George's colleagues next to me, and hopefully by 2030 the Purple Line will be online, right? And so we will see if those equity emphasis areas remain, but also trying to figure out how those residents will be able to remain as well. And so talk to me a little bit more about that process or that presumption, and whatever thoughts you might have on how we keep this statistic intact in 10 years, 7 years.
Thank you, Mr. Glass, for the question. I think that's one of the critical assumptions here with regards to equity emphasis area. It is based on today's data, right? We go with the U.S. Census ACS data. So we are saying based on the population distribution today, these are the areas where you have higher than average concentrations of low-income population and racial and ethnic minorities. So we know where the high-capacity transit station areas have been planned to build, and many of them are under construction. We can give you that number for 2045, but 2030 seems a little bit more certain. These are already underway. So that is, as of today, that is where they are, right? That 59%, or if it goes up higher, one can make the argument that we are providing lower cost, higher speed mobility options for people of lower income and racial and ethnic minorities. However, if that balance of jobs to housing ratio, you started your question with, if they're not living there within that half-mile or 1-mile radius, or if they don't have convenient, efficient means of accessing those high-capacity transit station areas. So housing affordability within that area is a challenge, and ensuring that income level and access to the stations are there. So I completely agree that these numbers, if they are looking very good and positive and promising, there is still a lot of work to do to remain and to realize those numbers, or else we could very easily be heading in another direction.
First, I have Board President Collins, and then Chair Randall. Oh, and then
in terms of your analysis, I guess my biggest concern is looking at the actual type of jobs that are being attracted and how that intertwines with, the goals that we're seeking. I mean, because one of the concerns I have in listening is, the individuals we talk about, equity emphasis areas, ensuring that these jobs are jobs that are available to many of our residents. And so when we think about, future development, my question more specifically is it part of our role to start looking at ensuring that the job market is one that is equitable to make this whole thing work for everyone?
That's a little bit beyond my thing to get into. However, I will acknowledge two things. One, our current analysis of equity emphasis areas, and particularly looking at the number of jobs, has not gone to that second level of review of what types of jobs are there, what are the income levels, what is the housing cost. And we have not gone to that second level. So we are at a higher level. But I would agree with you that there are two parts to the challenge or accelerating action. Not only bringing more jobs to those locations where you have those high-capacity transit mode available onto regional activity centers, but also ensuring that those jobs are paying living wages, and it is the kinds of jobs that our residents can make a comfortable, sustainable, livable living in those communities. So we don't have the data to get into here is how it is distributed, but that's a good point.
If I can add just a note on the job data itself, the data that we use, the population and the jobs, were from our cooperative forecasts that are prepared here at COG in cooperation and collaboration with the planning director, your planning directors, throughout the region. And the jobs are based on assumptions, both the jobs and the residential growth are based on assumptions of how your locally adopted comprehensive plans will be implemented and carried out over time. So there are already implicit assumptions at the local government level about the types of uses that will be coming online in the future, whether it's office development or retail development based on your comprehensive plan designations. So, that could definitely be, that doesn't quite come up to the regional lens that we're looking at this level at more as a macro granularity, but there is, it is important to keep in mind that these jobs data do come from land use assumptions that are made at the local level.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. And I think as Mr. Mercer outlined at the beginning of the meeting, some of the areas we want to look into as a board this year that falls very squarely into how are we doing economic development in our region and what are the jobs that we are attracting here. So thank you very much for raising that point. Chair Randall?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think we are having a really good conversation about policy and having no conversation about politics. And when we start talking about accessible or affordable housing and anything that has to do with equity, there's a political conversation you have to have as well. I decided a long time ago that there were a few things that I was more than willing to be an ex-elected official about. And for me, housing is one of the things that I'm happy to be, well, not happy to be, but willing to be an ex-elected official, as is, quite frankly, equity issues. And so, I don't know what's happening everywhere else, but in Loudoun, the pushback can be significant.
And so how we talk about this is as important as what we're talking about. And when I ask people, like, why don't you want houses in Loudoun? You know, I always get my kids' schools are overcrowded and the traffic. And so I tell them, well, that's not a housing, that's an infrastructure issue. And so it's important to know that if we're going to add homes, we have to add infrastructure. And infrastructure is not just transportation or transit. It's schools, it's green space, it's fire and rescue, it's police, it's all those things. As we're talking about adding homes or transit-oriented areas, we have to have a conversation about how to put the infrastructure in place as well. And I literally took myself to a training on how to actually discuss housing accessibility and how to have this conversation. I don't think it's an easy conversation for everyone to have in every community, and it can be a political kind of dicey ground. But we are fooling ourselves if we believe we can sit here and talk about these issues and not believe that these are going to be political issues, and that some of us, at least I know from my county, I got to make a decision about what's more important. I mean, I was elected for these 4 years. What am I going to do with these 4 years? I'm not promised 4 more years. And then these 4 years, I'm putting down some housing, and I'm doing some equity, and that's just how it goes. If I get elected, that's wonderful, and if I don't, I'm coming to y'all for a job at COG, Clark. Because it's a political conversation that we never seem to want to have, but we should. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Vice Chair Lux.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'll just make a couple points. One, on the point that was made just by Mr. Collins, I agree full-heartedly that we've got to figure out what are the types of jobs and the opportunities that will exist in those communities. Because I think about my own community along the Richmond Highway corridor, and it's very different than the rest of Fairfax County. I mean, you have lots of service-based jobs. You have positions that pay basically minimum wage. And the question is, how are people going to be able to survive? I mean, they've got to get a middle income salary and career, not just a minimum wage job. So the question is, how do we position, how do we provide workforce development opportunities and make available access to the varied and the larger aperture of opportunities that exist across the broader community. So that's one of the things I'm personally struggling with in my own district in Fairfax County and thinking about. And I think this is something that we have to probably think about here from a regional perspective as well. And then second, if I can just piggyback off of Chair Randall's comment about housing, I think one of the things that we have to figure out as well is how do we humanize housing? And I think we heard this at the last meeting with our former chair, Dorsey, is that we've got to figure a way for people to see themselves and their families and others in the people who will be living in this affordable housing or workforce housing. How are we going to define it? And I think the hard thing is that people are making assumptions about who is going to live in this housing, and they've got the wrong assumptions. So the question is, how do we help them really see who are these true residents? Some of them are public safety personnel. Some of them are going to be the folks who work in the hospital systems in ANOVA and HCA and other facilities in this region. And we need to support making that housing available, housing for seniors, housing for the first-time employees in this region. And we've got to be smart about that. And I'll just make this point and close. How do we package and how do we tell that story that helps people see it in a more humane way? And I think that's something that's a challenge before us and one that I would love to see us take on. Thank you very much, Madam Chairman.
Thank you. I have Council Vice President, or Council Vice Chair is your Ms. Blake, go ahead.
Thank you so much. And I really, I'm glad we're having this conversation. I do want to ask about sort of the trends in your research that you've seen, because one of the things we've noticed in Prince George's County, and no offense, we're a region where we notice a lot of people moving into Prince George's County because they can't afford housing in all of the counties, many of the counties here. So what we've noticed is that there's been a trend of moving outside of transit-oriented areas because it's really more affordable. So it's almost like they're traveling to the transit-oriented area for jobs, or that's, but moving away more into outskirts for affordable housing. So I want to know if you notice that trend. I would just say this: we are in the beginning stage, as you all outlined, the Blue Line Corridor, which is my district, where we are starting to do more transit-oriented development. We're moving in that space, but now that we're moving in that space, we anticipate there's going to be more expensive housing in and around all of the transit areas, much of what we've seen in Virginia, what we've seen in D.C., and even in Montgomery County. So what we're now worrying, the concern is now there is more of a discussion of affordable housing because we were the affordable housing. And now as we do the transit-oriented development, are we anticipating that as we do that, a certain group will start moving outside of the transit-oriented areas to the outskirts? Is that the trend that you're seeing in your research?
I'm going to turn over to Clark here.
A quick comment and then hand it back to Conti. I think this gets to the point I made earlier of looking at our assumptions from 3 or 4 years ago and seeing if those assumptions hold. There was an editorial today on the growth of the Fredericksburg region, and from 2020 to 2022, it's the first time in many, many decades that Fairfax has lost population. I will tell you, I am the anomaly, moving from the Richmond area, trying to find a home where I grew up in Alexandria. It's next to impossible. I know 24 families that are federal employees that have moved to Richmond that take the train down once every other week. And I think as the hot lanes go to Fredericksburg and open up, we need to drive till you qualify, right, is one of the board members sent me that during this discussion. So I think we're seeing some population migration out of the inner core and into Prince George's or even further. And I think that's only exacerbated by kind of the new normal, right? If you need to show up once every 10 days, you can hop on a train and do that, or you're more willing to get in your car and drive and sit in traffic for 2 hours if you only have to do it once every other week. So I think that's a really good question, and what that is doing to Prince George's County, where houses were affordable. Are they now going further up and people are going further out? I think we need to kind of look at those housing targets, ask those questions. But the housing stock, particularly where I'm used, in Alexander, Arlington, it is still so incredibly low, what's on the market, that the houses are still incredibly expensive. But I think we need to kind of, and getting to the assumptions on the jobs that are available. We talk about the number of technology jobs available. Well, that was available 3 years ago when remote work wasn't a thing. So how many of those jobs are still tied to the region, and how many of them could be done in Nashville or in Richmond? It's a good question. We need to look at that data, and Conti might have something to add. But the data does speak to folks moving out of the region right now.
Madam Chair.
I have Supervisor Gross and then Mayor Adams, and then I'm going to turn to the folks who are virtual and then move us on, because we could spend all afternoon talking about this, and I think this is a great conversation that we will continue to be having. So Supervisor Gross.
Thank you. And I would say that if we try not to get political here at this dais, we can talk about the small p political, perhaps, not the capital P political. But to be political here a little bit, for one thing, we'll talk about Virginia. The Commonwealth of Virginia needs to restructure its infrastructure, its tax structure, so that counties are not almost totally reliant on the real estate tax. That is a big problem for us in Virginia. I don't know how much that is a problem for others, but when we derive nearly 3/4 of our revenue from the real estate tax in Fairfax County, that creates a tremendous burden on the homeowner. And it also creates a burden on the tenant, because even though people say, well, they don't pay taxes, they may not get a tax bill in their own name, but they certainly do pay taxes to their rents. But I'd like to talk a little bit about the areas that I'm concerned would be left behind. We're talking about equity emphasis areas, but we've got and it's certainly in my district, which is almost entirely inside the Beltway, no high-capacity transit. The streetcar died. So we have some bus service. BRT may come along Route 7 in many years, but how do we, in all this work that we're doing on affordable housing, how do we make sure that those suburbs, which are pretty much the traditional suburbs, really don't get sort of stuck in the 50s and 60s and 70s when they were built? Because I'm really concerned about leaving them behind. And then we will have a different situation where people, are haves and have-nots. So have we looked at any of that for the areas of the metro map where there is, there's no train and no real access to high-capacity transit?
I would say the TPP looked at it, not separately as an issue. But in 2017, 2018, Mr. Allen was the TPB chair during that period. They convened a long-range plan task force looking at how can we address the transportation challenges, and land use figured prominently in that. One of the things that the task force did was recognize, for example, based on even back in around 2015, 2016, about 53% of Fairfax County residents were living and working in Fairfax County. So they were not coming in to the regional core at all. So as part of that, the TPB said building BRT systems throughout the region, not just radio, but connecting locations, activity centers within individual counties is going to be critical. So, Montgomery County has about 5 different BRT plans. They're working to fund it. We now have one in Virginia on Route 1, Route 7. So I think that is the idea of where there is no high capacity. That was intentionally the TPB. There was a debate. Should we include bus rapid transit as a high capacity transit? Shouldn't it be only for heavy rail? I said no. The cost and the time it takes to build heavy rail, BRT systems can be and should be recognized as high capacity. There are ways to operate it as a high capacity. So that is one of the transportation infrastructures. All the challenges around housing and all the other revenues that you all have noted, those are still there. But from a transportation perspective, there is one of the options to account for that.
Okay. Thank you. Mayor Adams?
Yes, I guess just a real brief statement on what we're talking about is, as we talk about that affordable housing and we talk about the workforce housing and those that would be participating in that, I think it's very, very important that all of us be very, very mindful and actually, be very deliberate in including those who are disabled in that conversation and making sure we identify them and not make any assumptions that they're covered anywhere when we talk about seniors and others, but that we be very deliberate in making sure that as we move forward and as we talk about that we include the disabled as a part of those who would participate in that house. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Adams. I'm going to turn now to, I think Supervisor Bailey has her hand up virtually.
I do, Madam Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I just wanted to, this is so essential to our entire region in that people are moving around as it relates to housing and transportation to assure that they're getting the best bang for their bucks. Everybody knows that. But is this an opportunity for us to, through this presentation, to maybe have one more walkthrough in terms of the focus so that we in our counties can really look at where there are opportunities? And not to add one more thing to the calendar, but I think that sometimes we miss things as it relates to our vision and our focus. And my colleague was saying about Prince George's County, the same thing is happening or has been happening in Prince William County. And so, we've been kind of caught off guard a little bit because our area is so transitioning, but it's also transitioning all of us as it relates to the hybrid workplace and what that looks like. And so is this an opportunity for us to maybe circle back with this presentation and dig a little deeper is what I'm saying.
Thank you very much, Supervisor Bailey. I think that we started a list for Mr. Keenan, and I think we will definitely see you back again, and this will be wrapped into the other conversations that we're having. Thank you for that point.
Thank you.
So I think, thank you everyone for the discussion on that and for the presentations. We're going to move now to our next agenda item, and we'll be looking at how we can accelerate action to meet COG's regional housing targets now. And we're going to be joined by COG's Community Planning and Service Director, Paul Desjardins, to review the regional housing needs, growth, and results from multifamily rental housing construction indicators report. And this is also in your packet.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Very pleased to be back here before you. I was very interested sitting in the audience to hear how the conversation transitioned and how inextricably linked land use and transportation are. I mean, Mr. Keenan was talking about the spatial dynamics of focusing growth, and it was very informative to me to hear how we transition specifically to the topic I'm going to talk about. I also want to point out I'm joined by my colleague Hillary Chapman, who is our housing program manager. She came before you last month to talk about point-in-time work and can clearly enhance many of the questions that you all may have for me, as she has much deeper subject matter expertise. Back to the work. Again, Mr. Keenan talked about high-capacity transit stations, equity emphasis areas. We're here to talk about the housing targets. Again, these are the pillars that undermine the Region Forward goal, that they are, as I mentioned before, inextricably linked. Specifically, again, the 2030 targets that this board adopted 4 years ago, and you'll actually see a couple of slides for those of you who were on the board at that time. I'll call up a couple of them later in the presentation so they will look familiar to you. And what were the housing targets adopted by this body? Again, the amount, the accessibility, and the affordability. So we took on this challenge, and I know, Madam Chair, you're very interested in economic development. We actually took this on as an economic competitiveness question. Mr. Keenan talked about the jobs to household ratio, and part of why we stepped in, leaned in, if you will, on housing was we realized we needed to provide more housing to accommodate the workers for the jobs that we believe are coming to the region. So back to that calculus of jobs to household ratios and whatnot. The 3 targets, over and above the housing that was projected for the region in the next 10 years, we needed to do 75,000 more units. Wanted 75%, 3/4 of all the new housing to be near high-capacity transit stations or activity centers, as Mr. Keenan mentioned. And lastly, this is the hard one, and we'll talk a bit about this, is that 75% of the housing should be affordable to low and moderate income households. So again, just a quick refresher on the framing of that effort. I've come before you many times. This is a slide that I've shared with you that enhanced it a little bit. Is that a little bit better? All right, thank you. We were looking at trying to do a total of 320,000 net new housing units between 2020 and 2030. So that's what that red dashed line is. That's what our target. We should be doing roughly 32,000 units a year. The blue line is the actual number of units based on permits that are being approved. And what you can see, obviously, is in the center when the Great Recession, the foreclosure crisis hit. But if you look in the last several years, we actually peaked. Last year, 2022, about 25,000, almost 26,000 units, more than we've actually permitted since 2005. So that's the good news. But when you look at that trend, we've been below that target for many years now. And so, in fact, when you look at the 3 years so far, we've actually added about 72,000 units. To hit that 320,000 unit target by 2030, we need to do about 248,000 more, which means we actually need to be doing more like 35,000 units per year. So I've said that when we presented before, every year that we are falling behind, it raises the bar, causes us to need to do more, if you will. I want to talk now and pivot to housing and the types of units that we need, talking about both structure and affordability and location. Again, Mr. Keenan has laid the framework of where we want housing to go. I apologize, the circle sort of cuts it off, but what I'm intending to show there is About 31% of the housing in the region, according to American Community Survey, is multifamily housing. And when we talk about leaning in and creating housing near transit, that really is what we're talking about. It will be very, very difficult to create a lot of single-family detached units near housing. I want to focus in just a minute, though, on that center section, or the part that's circled most prominently, multifamily rental, because I won't be going into it in detail, but as you said, Madam Chair, there is a report here that talks, and I'll pick up a few highlights from it on multifamily construction. The goal here, the question I would raise to you is, given that we want to do more in this space, what could be done to increase the production in this area or increase the share of all net new from 31% to some slightly higher total, if you will? So again, I mentioned this comes from the report that's in your packet. I won't go into detail. Source of the information is CoStar, very noted for tracking office construction. We have a companion report on that. What we're looking at here, though, from the CoStar data, this is the last 30 years or so of multifamily construction. And a couple highlights that called your attention. It's increased over time. It peaked on about 2015, fell off a bit, but we still did about 14,000 multifamily housing units last year. The other thing I'd point out to you, though, what's most prominent is the colors in each of the surface chart denote the types of units that are being built. So if you look in the very center, the most predominant type of multifamily rental unit that's being produced is one bedroom, followed probably about a third fewer by two bedrooms, but very little larger multifamily rental units. And therein lies a bit of a challenge that we'll talk on about what can be done to produce more, what can be done to preserve what is already existing, and at what price point. Talking about price points, this comes directly from that report. This is just simply a comparison by the number of bedrooms, the unit type, if you will. This is actually constant dollars, inflation-adjusted dollars going back to 2000 or so. At the top, I put a reference, though, from the Housing Targets work from 4 years ago, where we determined that housing costs really should not exceed $2,500. This is a very complicated conversation, I'm aware of, for different program needs and whatnot, but that was the target that we set. Tony and I were looking at data earlier today from the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, and it suggests something like 3 out of every 5 housing unit in this region is renter-occupied. And as we can well imagine, people who are tenants in renter units typically have lower incomes on average than the population as a whole, very mix of hourly wages, hour earnings, and whatnot. And the National Low-Income Housing Coalition actually suggested rather than $2,500, if you look at the incomes for most renters, that target should probably be more like $1,900. So again, you can see where that would fall on the spectrum relative to what we had teed up before. There's a very good bright spot in the report. Again, we've been tracking the CoStar data for about 10 years. This is just looking at this last particular year. What you can see there is in 2021, lion's share of new multifamily construction was inside the Beltway. 85% of it, well above the target that we set for residential construction, was near high-capacity transit and regional activity centers. So that is a bright spot. It's a trend that's actually been in place for several years now, so that is a good thing. But again, as I mentioned before, we have to look back at the price of units that are actually being approved and the size of those units as well. Turning very quickly to the housing market and what is occurring, this is a chart that looks at change in house price, the actual sales price, not the change, but the sales price for different housing structure types going back to pre-pandemic, going back 5 years ago to January 2013. You can see where prices actually peaked last year, as we're well aware. They've fallen off. Generally, all structures, except for condominiums, have seen the most significant increase of single-family detached. Obviously, they've fallen back somewhat in prices, and we talked a bit before about the market, but they're still well above the average prior to the pandemic. This is something we're all well aware of as well. In less than a year, mortgage rates jumped by 4 basis points, from a little over 3.3% to a peak of just over 7% in October. They've fallen back. When I looked Monday, I think nationally the average rate is about 6.4%, 6.5%. But here's the impact. This is an illustrative example. Prior to the pandemic, at those lower rates, a $500,000 mortgage would have been about $2,200. Current rates, about 6.5%, that mortgage is about almost $3,200, $1,000 more, about 45% more. That's actually encouraging. At the peak, it was almost $1,200 more in October. So clearly the impact that we've seen on rates, and this goes to the heart of our challenge that was mentioned before. We already have an affordability crisis, an affordability problem, and if interest rates are pushing the cost per unit even higher, it is forcing homeowners to make some very, or potential homeowners to make some very hard choices about where they may or may not choose to live and purchase. Lastly, this is one of the two charts that I shared with this body 4 years ago when we began this journey with the planning directors and housing directors. We do need to look at all sorts of housing types. This is the full spectrum. This is a very popular graphic that's been shown in many planning schools, lots of public forums. But from the gamut, again, of single-family homes on the far left to mid-rise and high-rise residential construction on the right, we need to look at all sorts of housing structures and types. Predominant units, I mentioned before about the types of apartments, the size of apartments. The structure type actually predominantly is about 4 to 6 stories recently. So it's a good community scale. I think the development community might say, there might be some challenges needing to go higher. We might want to lean in on things like bonus densities and whatnot. But it's a very compatible framework, if you will, when you look at the product that's actually coming online now. And then lastly, these were the 3 challenges that the planning directors teed up back in April of 2019, and I would assert they really still do exist. At the local level, there are land use regulatory issues that may need to be addressed, revisiting policies that may make it easier to both incentivize the market, but also help ensure that the product that comes online is affordable for homeowners. Market forces, we dealt with supply chains during the pandemic. We're now feeling the effects of inflationary forces, both on products and labor supply. And then we talked before about the labor market. It's an incredibly tight labor market in the construction industry, as it is in many other sectors. And then that last bullet, community dynamics. It's an inescapable part of this process. I heard it mentioned earlier. It could be positive, they could be negative, but they are, in fact, the challenges that come to bear. So wrapping up, these were the questions that Hillary and I would pose to you. Again, what can we do region-wide to kickstart things to the 35,000 now unit production that we really need? What can we do to preserve, create more affordable, particularly 3 and larger rental apartments in the right places, again, but at the right price points? What is the gamut of financial tools and incentives that really are needed both to ensure affordability, not just for homeowners, but for renters as well? And then policies that we could enact, what could we do at the local level, as I said, to both encourage production, preservation, and affordability? And then last bullet, I changed that euphemism from community dynamics to more popular, what can we do to address and what can we do to change NIMBYism to YIMBYism? If you aren't familiar with it, NIMBYism is not in my backyard. YIMBYism is yes in my backyard. So that is all I have to say. And again, my colleague Hillary is here who can answer even the tougher questions that you may pose.
Thank you, Ms. Desjardins and Ms. Chapman for that presentation. If you want to leave the questions up there, obviously in the next 5 or 7 minutes, we're not going to answer all of those, but we will. The point of today's meeting is really to remind us all the work that's been done and tee us up into answering some of these big questions as we move forward. I just want to start us off and ask maybe a request moving forward and looking at the report. Can we take the CoStar data on rents, the trends, and overlay that with wages and where wages have been in the region? I think that goes back to Mr. Collins and Mr. Luck's point before, but as you know, again, we're looking at job growth and everything. I think it's important that, and I believe the trends are going to show our rents are increasing and our wages in the region are not keeping up with that. So I think that's really important to keep that front and center. So I'll turn it over to my colleagues now. Yeah, Councilmember Wolf, you want to kick us off?
2 things on this. First off, at our retreat, and our staff looked at this When we looked at renters, it was more than 50%. We edited that out. So that gets back to availability of housing, cost of that housing, and the incomes of that population. And how do we approach it? Now, it was helpful for us because it allowed us in our discussion to sort of set aside the homeowners. Not that there aren't things that can't be done or we can't always get better. So let's focus on the rental side of the equation in our community. So that was really helpful. The other thing I'll point out, and I'm going to be I'm going to say I'm guilty on this, but I believe that most of the jurisdictions here have very consciously skewed the housing choices through zoning, planning, whatever process we've had towards single family and studio units because we do not want more students because more kids in schools, number one cost of government. And that's the reality we have to face. It's ridiculous. Well,
I think we can unpack that in a lot of different ways. Yeah, so, well, yeah. My microphone was on when you said that. So I have a question and then I have a comment. My question is, when we're looking at, I feel like we're calculating new units when we're trying to reach our goal. And one of the things that we've been working really hard on in Loudoun County is preservation and maybe adaptive reuse. And I know Arlington County, I almost hate to say missing middle with my colleague Kristen over there, but you know, those would increase units on lots, right? So my question is, are those counted when you're looking at the units? And then secondly, to the last question, changing NIMBY to YIMBY, and I'm sure my colleagues are all doing this across the region, but I've ushered through 2 rezonings for housing. I've got 3 rather large ones on the table right now in my district, really large ones actually, at least for Loudoun County, maybe not for the district. But one thing that I am always trying to do is asking the community, what do you want? What do you want? What can I, and I say it to the developers too, I'm like, I need to sell this to my constituents. We're going to take half of this shopping center and turn it into housing. I need to be able to sell this. So what does the community want? It can be anything from a pedestrian bridge to bike paths and walkways. It could be, right now I'm working really hard to make sure we've got money to renovate an older library that's kind of next door to the shopping center. So that's, and then usually the developer can write off whatever that proffer is against their facilities fees that they should be paying to the county, right? So I'm directing money directly into my district and directly into the schools and into the infrastructure, and it's not going into the big county pot, because if that money just goes into the big county pot, then it can be used almost anywhere, right? Or it can be used in a different type of district that includes mine but isn't necessarily directly in there. So, and it's meeting after meeting after meeting. I have a town hall next week, which would almost be my 3rd town hall on one of these, where the community can just come and ask questions for 2 hours. So that's how I'm trying to turn NIMBY into YIMBY.
So I can answer part of your question. Actually, I'm going to turn to Hillary a little bit about the community engagement and outreach. So CoStar only focuses on multifamily rental. They're very comprehensive on office space, but they only look at multifamily rental, don't have condos, co-ops, anything like that. We do get from your staff, and Mr. Canan alluded to it earlier, the cooperative forecasts, which are the growth projections that filter up through your permitting and plan review process. So in aggregate, we do capture that from you and your colleagues around the region. I will say, back to both engagement and a couple things, proffers and impact fees. It's something we also bring together the planning directors, and I think that's probably a conversation we might want to tee up with them, because it is very much a transactional base. What's it going to take to get this project through, which varies dramatically around the region. But I would suspect in the current environment it's probably even more complicated than it was before. And back to the NIMBY versus YIMBY, again, it's that challenge of converting from one single purpose function to what we would like to be mixed use, and the engagement of just, again, well, this isn't what I signed on for, why is it changing, or whatnot. The other thing I would let Hillary comment on a bit is the Fair Housing Plan and the degree to which they engaged for community engagement there.
Sure, I'd be happy to mention that, but I'd also just really quickly wanted to add to Paul's remarks in terms of community engagement, and that hopefully this is the right venue to do this. Is that there is safety in numbers to a certain extent when you're having these conversations. You have when we can speak across not just your own community. I know that doesn't help in a specific town hall, but to know that there are. Let your residents know that this conversation is happening in a similar vein in other places, not just in Loudoun County, but across the region. For example, I just want to just give a little shout out to the district for, a few years ago when they did their study, their framework for equity and growth. There was a decision that was made to state we're going to look at what each portion of the district is going to contribute. And so having that countywide, citywide, statewide, whatever that your jurisdiction might be, to say we are all going to contribute, every community is going to contribute. And here's how we want to go about it, and engage them in this way and say, we're all in this, we're all looking at this together. And it's just a matter of how are we going to get there. So, and of course in this body you have, again, a cadre of other elected officials from which you can draw from inspiration. And we also have, our Housing Communications Playbook as a resource that can always be there to help you have those difficult conversations. And I'm happy to go on ad nauseum, as some of you know, about the Fair Housing Plan, which I will not do here. Suffice to say, right, that equity, I think, underlies all of these conversations, and understanding how we are intentional, and I will give absolute, complete, utter, and due respect to all of you for having these difficult conversations, because they are not going to be easy. And this plan that is out now for public comment, this is where the rubber hits the road, and decisions such as, do we use our limited public resources to create more units at deeper levels of affordability, or do we take this fixed pot of resources that we have to create greater affordability at higher levels? That's a difficult conversation to have. The Fair Housing Plan would recommend that we go in the direction of choosing deeper affordability because of the ability to access more units. And to Mayor Adams' point, for those with disabilities, we need to make sure that we have more accessibility and affordability sort of across the region. So sorry, I'm just straight there.
Thank you, Ms. Chapman. And I may ask the staff when we send around the materials from the meeting today if we also include the, I forget what it was called, guide on how to have tough conversations on housing. I don't think that's exactly what we called it, but it was something like that. Maybe re-upping that for all of us would be helpful. I have Vice Chair Allen's going to have the last word on this, and we're going to, Mayor Newton. Nope, you're good? Okay. Vice Chair Allen.
I'll try to be brief with the last word. I thought the slide that said community dynamics was about the kindest way you could put what Ms. Randall talked about on there. I appreciate Ms. Chapman bringing up her last point, because that was one of the things I felt like was actually missing from these bullet points of questions is specifically the natural tension that exists around how do we balance the need for deep affordability of units at 30%, 50% of AMI, FMI, MFI, versus 80% or 100%. One of the things I've certainly found, and I would wager my colleagues have as well, is that it is very difficult to communicate to the general public what in the heck does 80% or 120% of AMI or MFI actually mean. Because when I reframe it and talk about a 50% or below, one bedroom, and I say that the first-year teacher in our schools and a beginning firefighter or police officer will not qualify for that, but could never afford a place on their own. When I reframe it of the dollar amounts, then the same people who were telling me how they don't want this type of housing, oh, but wait a minute, no, I definitely want my teachers and my firefighters and my police officers in my community. So sometimes I think the communication and how we describe it's important. But I I do think there's a natural tension around the deep affordability and then what we'll generally call workforce affordability, so that there are not two extremes that get created, but we have yet another missing middle. The question I guess I was going to ask was also just around that tiny sliver in your graph of the 3 bedrooms. And I don't know if there are other jurisdictions we want to look to or if we've found other successful models, but I do think that is something that comes up repeatedly, is how to avoid just creating 1 bedrooms or a studio den, but actually having 3 bedroom plus units that actually can allow families to be able to see their future in our neighborhoods, in our cities, and throughout our communities.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Allen. As chair, I'll take a point to bring up. One of the things I noticed on the slide was looking at how we're financing things. And I think this could be a really interesting place for COG to dig into in the future. We know much of the affordable housing relies on low-income housing tax credits. They are not sufficient to fund our affordable housing. We look at Montgomery County, we look at Prince George's, how many projects we get a year, is not going to help us meet our goals. So I think this is a place that COG could come together and actually advocate for at the federal level, that we need better financial tools in order to allow us to build more of this housing. So I'd like to maybe put that on our to-do list to dig into a bit more. All right, I think with that we have, we'll move on now to Agenda Item 10, our Regional Roadway Safety and How Safe Our Roads Are report. We are going to ask now and be joined by COG Transportation Systems Performance Planning Program Director, Andrew Meese. Mr. Meese, you have a very long title. And the Washington Regional Alcohol Program President, Kurt Erickson. And I'll turn it over to Mr. Meese to get us started.
Thank you, Chair Stewart. Thank you, Chair Stewart and members of the board. I will be giving a brief overview of regional roadway safety activities and resources as context for Kurt Erickson's RAP presentation. I think there's probably great awareness of our region's, our nation's roadway safety issues, unacceptable levels of fatalities on the region's roadways, the significant gap between our aspirations of 0 deaths and the ground realities, and the need to expedite any actions that are multi-pronged, regionally consistent, and coordinated, working at all levels. This is a data table that the TPB saw in November and December. They have to consider a target setting and reporting process every year by the U.S. Department of Transportation, and of course, these are they are prescribed under performance-based planning and programming. These are obviously, these are data are not going in the right direction, and they certainly are not zero. You have numbers of fatalities, a number of serious injuries rates, and non-motorist fatalities and serious injuries together, and this is the data that are, in a sense, prescribed under federal law and regulations. So activities at the regional level, and this, of course, is in addition to things that go on at the national level, the state level, the local level. These are, quite a variety of things that go on here at the regional level, and chronologically, starting with the RAP program that you'll hear about in a minute. And we've got several other things here. For the sake of time, I won't go into them, but I did want to perhaps concentrate on a couple of things that is a deeper look at the data that the TPB and staff did a couple of years ago, and the resolution that the TPB passed in response to that, which was a multi-part resolution that provided some policy guidance as well as establishing the Regional Roadway Safety Program. So looking at the data deep dives, the idea is if you look at a general number, well, what's behind the number? What are some of the factors that are more significant than others? And there's, of course, a lot of factors that could go into traffic fatalities and serious injuries. And in the deep dive in the data set that we had, these were some of the things that jumped out. The behavioral factors, and that first bullet up there, and we've highlighted impaired driving. And then the areas where we see in our region the pedestrians, of course, intersections and major arterials. And I'm sorry, there was a little bit of a formatting issue on this slide, but this one of our partner agencies, Maryland Department of Transportation, showed this at a recent event. And what I liked about this one was the overlaps. The lower right circle in Maryland was a number of occupant fatalities that were involved in impaired driving. And the top was unbelted, and you can see they overlap. And sometimes they're both belted and impaired, right? And so there's always a multiplicity of factors going on, and that's another thing we have to study. Going back to the resolution that the TPB passed in 2020, one of the things it did was to try to identify proven countermeasures, strategies that member agencies could consider. And this is just a snapshot of those that involved impaired driving, and there's a much longer list, like 45, that are in that, so I would recommend taking a look at that. Here's the calls for action from that, and this is what I'm going to use to transfer over to Kurt Erickson here. It is established the Regional Roadway Safety Program, where TPB provides some technical assistance in terms of consultants for planning and studies in traffic safety. Urge members to implement applicable safety measures as identified in the resolution. Called upon members to adopt equitable Vision Zero policies. Affirm safety is a top priority with some of those projects, programs, and policies that are the good countermeasures, and maybe some legislative actions there at the bottom, and I think that Kurt can talk about those more in a moment. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Kurt Erickson.
Let me jump to the next slide. And that gives away my hand. I just realized when we were doing this presentation. What was asked me to cover was kind of an overview of who the nonprofit RAP is, the key findings of a survey that we've done now for a study, for 30 years with the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, which I'll be telling you the findings from, and then some recommendations on this. So first is, if you're not familiar with us, you may know us more by the name RAP, but we're a 40-year-old, actually we celebrated our 40th anniversary last year, a 40-year-old nonprofit organization founded in 1982 to fight drunk driving and underage drinking. We do this through public education. An example of that is we run Virginia's Drive Sober, Get Pulled Over campaign, which is themed Act Like It. That if you're old enough to drink, to act like it. And if you've seen those TV spots, congratulations, you watch 18 to 34-year-old male-targeted television. We do innovative health education programs that are both school-based and work-based, trying to prevent drunk driving even before it begins. And then we do advocacy efforts in D.C., Maryland, and Virginia, a couple of which we'll mention in a minute. That all said, we're probably best known for a program that we've done since 1991 called Sober Ride, which is a free safe ride service on 5 different holidays to try to get people that are out celebrating the holidays in the greater Washington area of legal age and older, which is 21, that if they need a safe ride home, they can. And during the time period that we've offered this, 84,000 Washington area residents have taken advantage of this local and life-saving program. Just on New Year's Eve, just last month, we had almost 1,000 persons use it just in one single evening. It basically translated to the removal of a would-be drunk driver off our shared roadways every 23 seconds. But one of the things that we've done is the bottom bullet there for the last 30 years is that we've teamed up with COG to do a regional study on how we're doing drunk driving-wise as a region. So you can probably cull this information of how we're doing this in Fairfax or how we're doing it in Prince George's County or how we're doing it in the district. But this really looks at as an aggregate and tells you how we're doing, but it does break it down into those localities as well. It is a 17-page report. I'm not going to walk you through it. You do have a copy, but when all is said and done, those 17 pages are distilled down to these findings that you have here, so I want to walk you through those. In a nutshell, it's the proverbial mixed bag of findings. These are 2021 numbers, so even though this report was issued in November 2022, these are 2021 numbers. The good news, and it's really good news in the fact that it counters national trends, which nationally, and we'll talk about in a second, drunk driving fatalities during the COVID era are actually up. But in the greater Washington area, they went down in 2021. In fact, they went down by 10%. That's great news. I don't want to shy away from that point. It is, however, countered by the fact that during that same period, 2021, that local drunk driving crashes, drunk driving injuries, and drunk driving arrests all went up. In terms of the fatalities, again, those went down 10%. It's actually the lowest level in half a decade, but it totals 85, and as would be argued, 85 is 85 too many. In terms of drunk driving injuries for 2021, those went up by over 17%. We had 1,522 persons injured in drunk driving crashes in 2021. This is it reverses the previous year's decrease in those numbers. For drunk driving crashes, those went up over 13%, and we now total over 10 DUI crashes every single day just in this region. And then lastly, drunk driving arrests. Those went up surprisingly. We can talk a little bit about staffing as one of our recommendations for law enforcement, and there is established proof of that law enforcement is understaffed from what they were doing DUI enforcement-wise pre-COVID. But we saw a 3.7% increase in DUI arrests, specifically in the greater Washington area. This increase counters the previous 2 years' decreases, but still totals over 10,000 annually. So just in the greater Washington area alone, we're annually arresting 10,248 persons for DUI. Again, this is conversely to what's happening nationally. Nationally, during the COVID era in 2020, according to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, drunk driving fatalities went up. They went up over 14%. Last year, 2021, 2 years ago in 2021, they went up 5%. We're showing a downward trend, which is great. I will tell you, however, though, that whereas drunk driving fatalities are down, overall local traffic deaths are up, and they're up 17%, which pretty much mirrors what's happening nationally. So short version of all of this is that while we're favorably bucking the national trends in terms of fatals, we're conversely seeing increases in the numbers of local drunk driving crashes, injuries, and arrests. Again, as a region, we're still averaging 28 DUI arrests a day and 10 drunk driving crashes every single day. I should also mention in closing for this report is that today, a quarter, in fact, it's almost exactly a quarter, it's 24.92% of all traffic fatalities in this region still involve drunk drivers. These are 100% preventable crashes, but they're still taking the toll that they are on our roadways. What I was asked to make recommendations on, and it's funny because we did a similar presentation and it didn't stray that far from where we were when we talked about this in 2020, but I did update a number of them. This is oversimplification, but the fact of the matter is I think they'd be echoed if you had any anti-drunk driving organizations speaking before you. I think they'd echo some of the same things. Obviously, doubling down on what works. We know sobriety checkpoints work. It's actually less, in my opinion, than it is the findings of organizations that have studied these, like the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, that said that if they're done well, that they can reduce drunk driving fatalities by as much as 20%. Technology, including ignition interlocks, which we'll talk about in a second, so I'll skip over that for right now. Seatbelts. I know it's a cliche that you hear that your seatbelt is your best defense against a drunk driver, but the real bottom line is that the routine wearing of seatbelts is the single most effective measure to reduce crash-related deaths and injuries. I bring this up because whereas Maryland and D.C., it's primary seatbelt laws, Virginia, it is not. Increased testing. There's been a number of bills, both in Maryland and Virginia, to increase the testing of persons that are killed in traffic crashes to distinguish whether substances were involved and whether it's alcohol or whether it's drugs, and to then implement the right countermeasures. The mandatory for all drivers in fatal crash have been legislation that's been introduced in Maryland in the last couple of years, although not this year. And in the two Virginia budget bills, the competing bills right now being debated in the House and the Senate version, there was wording in both to have that state's Department of Forensic Sciences test all the blood in all persons killed, or all drivers, killed in fatal crashes. That, however, did not make it across the finish line. That is not currently existing in either of those bills. Maryland for the last couple of years and Virginia this year is looking to have oral fluids pilot programs. Maryland with a pilot program per county. Virginia right now is having Department of Forensic Sciences implement an oral fluids testing program. This is in concert with that state right now looking at creating a per se level for marijuana and to be able to charge accordingly. The last bullet there, I'm going to go to one more slide really quick, is embracing technology. DC, Maryland, and Virginia all require ignition interlocks, meaning that if you are convicted of a DUI in any of those localities, you have to get an in-car breathalyzer installed in your vehicle for a minimum of 6 months. This is life-saving technology. You've got groups like CDC that says that you can reduce recidivism, DUI recidivism, by as much as 70%. Actually, there's a bill being heard literally as we speak right now in Annapolis that's looking to even tighten that up, as 50% of persons that get convicted of that state of a DUI get probation. And there's a bill being heard as we speak now to require an interlock as a condition of probation. In Maryland and Virginia, there's testing of passive alcohol sensors on commercial vehicles so that you're not proactively blowing into a tube to demonstrate that you haven't been drinking. It's taking in through other means above your steering column, and it will prevent the vehicle from being operable if it senses you've been drinking. And I want to make sure we respect time here. So the last two is alternatives to DUI. I mentioned sober ride, and the fact that, like I said, we've taken 84,000 would-be drunk drivers off area roadways, but it'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge our public partners. We do get public support from the DC, Maryland, and Virginia Highway Safety Offices, as well as private funding for this issue. Rideshare, I bring this up because with that program, the Drive Sober Get Pulled Over program that we run in Virginia, we annually survey 600 21 to 35-year-old male drivers, and make no mistake about it, rideshare is their #1 chariot of choice of how they get home at the end of an evening. The WMATA third bullet there, when we did this program or made these recommendations in 2020, that's when hours were cut. This is pre-COVID, but when hours were cut, we were clearly advocating for the restoration of hours, including the evening hours. But I wanted to give you an example of how well this works, and the fact is that for New Year's Eve, I think most of you know that Metro, both rail service and bus service, not only had service extended till 2 p.m., but between 8 p.m. and 2 a.m. on New Year's Eve, it was free. And I can tell you that that absolutely helped balance the load for getting would-be drunk drivers off our area roadways. And then very lastly, under the heading of the traffic safety is public safety, is enforcement. We are simply not, law enforcement is not where they should be in terms of DUI enforcement. Virginia put out numbers for its law enforcement, said that there's a 40% vacancy rate in some cities of law enforcement. Virginia State Police has 250 unfilled positions, and the Virginia Sheriff's Association is reporting 28% vacancy rate amongst its ranks. So if we're expecting to have people, law enforcement, out there doing sobriety checkpoints, doing saturation patrols, it's really hard to do when they're working off of a skeletal staff. So I can't make a stronger recommendation than that, and that's actually one of our focus points in the budget session in Virginia as we speak. So that's it, except for Annie's and my points of contact. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you very much for that presentation. And Mr. Erickson, thank you for all the work that RAP does. We very much appreciate it. We have a few moments for some questions. Just to remind my colleagues, we do have one other agenda item today. Chair Randall.
Yeah, I'll be brief. Kirk, thank you so much for this information. You know, I talk all the time about how we can't talk about one single drug, one single substance as we do opioids, and this is the reason. If you ask, 100 people who use substances, what do you use? You get 10 that say I use PCP. You get, 5 that say I use cocaine. You get, 40 that say I use opioids. You're going to get 90 that say I use alcohol. Alcohol is the most co-occurring drug with every other substance. And so if you use alcohol, another substance, you are also drinking. It is still the most dangerous drug, even more than opioids. Alcohol is the most dangerous drug. And so the work you all are doing is so important, and I really do appreciate it.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Sorry, Mayor.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for the report. Very, very interesting findings. Yeah, just listening to the statistics that you put forward, as we move from the pandemic to the present, there are some trends in policing that may begin to impact what we see, just in terms of automated traffic enforcement. And with our police departments throughout the region, it is challenging, staying up to the full number of folks that are out there patrolling our streets. And also, I can say in some jurisdictions, there's a move. The police are focusing on violent crime, and they're not so focused on. I mean, they're still focused on traffic enforcement, but that's not always So what I'm trying to say is that, as we are moving forward, I'm wondering if you expect any of these statistics to shift, with automated traffic enforcement being more and more of a factor in just motor vehicle.
Yeah, I think automated enforcement plays a great role in red light cameras and speed cameras, but I don't know of a technology, an external technology like that, that's going to deal with DUI, minus the passive sensors that at some point are going to be in fleet vehicles, and all of us are going to be subject to. In other words, we're not going to be able to start our vehicles if we've been drinking. But who would have thought that during the COVID era that we would have had these numbers go up? I mean, if you would ask me to predict this in 2020, that during a period of lockdown that we would have had an increase nationally of drunk driving fatalities, is really staggering. I think now we're actually dealing with seemingly, and I can tell you this by our sober ride numbers, again, a 30-year-old program. We've been doing this for 30 years. Just on Halloween, we had 1,000 people utilize the program. There's such a pent-up demand for people to get back out, get their drink on, congregate, and then how do they get home? So the more that we can give them alternative routes, the better.
Yeah, I think anecdotally, I think some drivers are just more aggressive, with less traffic than more traffic. People are more aggressive, and I think that'll perhaps continue to play out. But I would also speculate that with drunk and impaired drivers, they're much more likely to run a red light camera or to trip a speeding camera than an unimpaired driver. So thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Jordan. Chair Mendelson.
Thank you. Just a quick question. What is oral fluid testing?
Yeah, so oral fluid testing would be a way to have a swab. It's a less invasive way to get a swab taking of your cheek. That's a good indicator for marijuana use amongst other drugs as well. I think we didn't really talk about it, but one of the things with D.C., Maryland, and Virginia all having various degrees of allowability of marijuana use, as that creeps into the driving culture and the trends that we're seeing, and to know the role that it plays, we're going to have to look at as much testing as possible. The panels that we use right now for DUI, and I'm not, yes, this is oversimplifying, but if law enforcement find a .08 or above, they're not usually doing a deeper dive. It's costly to do a deeper panel dive to find out if there's poly use as well, as the chairman had mentioned. And so to be able to tell what the drug is, like for instance, in the District of Columbia, I believe it's 20 or 21% of all of all blood tests for impaired driving involve PCP. So it may actually surprise you what they're finding that's out there. But as marijuana becomes more used by drivers, I think that's the concern we have. But to answer your question, it's a less invasive way to be able to measure intoxication.
Alcohol or marijuana or other drugs?
Marijuana. It probably is as well as others. I don't know. The gold standard is blood for alcohol. And urine probably secondary, and breath as a preliminary means, not usually being able to be entered into court.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go to our virtual participants. Mayor Snyder.
Thank you very much. Thanks for putting this on the agenda. Behind every one of these statistics are real live people, spouses, children that are getting killed on our highways and seriously injured, and all the ramifications. So the fact of the matter is, a lot of these are violent crimes. They're certainly violent. So along with gun violence and this issue of highway safety, I hope that the board will continue its focus, and that will outline what more we need to do as individual jurisdictions. Just as we're looking at housing, we need to look at what more we can do to drive down these terrible numbers. So thanks again for putting this on the agenda. I view this as right up at the top of what our priorities ought to be. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Snyder. Thank you very much, Mr. Erickson and Mr. Meese. We appreciate you being here with us today. Our last agenda item for today is we're going to bring up and be joined by Matt Erskine and Stu Solomon from Connected DMV to learn about the Mid-Atlantic Hydrogen Hub and their efforts to secure federal funding as a designated clean hydrogen hub for the region. This is a great example of accelerating action to meet our regional climate goals. And I will note, as they're getting settled, that the COG board has back in October, we had a special briefing on this for an hour to go in depth on that. And a year ago, in January of 2022, we did pass a resolution authorizing COG to submit an application, receive and expand funds to participate in the H2 Twin Cities initiative. And so we thank you for being back here today. We do have a resolution that we'd like to take action on today. So speed is of the essence, so we get to our voting item before our colleagues need to leave for their engagement. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and we will be prompt. As a quick reminder, Connected DMV is a 501c3 organization. We were founded and with support, direct support from COG in our creation formally over 3 years ago. We do complex programs that drive economic development and social equity together. So we work at that really good jobs and development intersection with economic growth. Quantum is an area that we're working to help create the capital of quantum here in the region, but we're here today to give you an update, as you said, on the hydrogen, the climate initiative that we're pursuing on behalf of the region. So thank you for that opportunity. This is a very large-scale opportunity for climate, for hydrogen that's competitive across the nation through a funding opportunity being offered by the Department of Energy. And Matt's going to give us a quick update on that.
Great, thank you very much. Grateful for COG's partnership over the last 2 years. This has been a 2-year journey. Our 3 primary objectives, as you can see, are to drive a real clean hydrogen economy here for all of Maryland, for the district, and all of Virginia. So a truly tri-state region, and that is to drive solutions for clean energy, and it's also to drive economic opportunity for all our communities, and of course, the environmental benefits. And then from a tactical standpoint, we very much want to capture our fair share of this $8 billion that the U.S. Department of Energy has made available to their regional Clean Hydrogen Hub program. And I'll update you quickly on where that stands. I think I won't belabor this slide. I think you have it. But basically, the takeaway is hydrogen is an excellent solution for those very hard-to-abate sectors in our economy. And our purpose is to contribute hydrogen solutions as part of the broad portfolio of clean energy solutions, not as a silver bullet, not as a replacement, but rather as both a complement and a supplement to the great work that's already being done around clean energy in our region and across the country. The Mid-Atlantic Hydrogen Hub, we're now up to a coalition, a cross-sector coalition of local government, universities and colleges and community colleges, community groups, and industry organizations, now more than 60 of those members of our coalition across Virginia, Maryland, and the district that is driving the solution set and are behind this effort to get our share of $8 billion from the U.S. Department of Energy's program. The other thing I'd highlight from this slide is it's all about matching supply and production through distribution and storage through the end use demand. Those who want to use hydrogen for clean energy want to know that there's a secure, sustainable supply, and those that are working on producing hydrogen want to know that there is sufficient demand, and both want to know that there is a sustainable infrastructure that creates that linkage, the storage and distribution. And that's what we're working on with this hub, to create truly an ecosystem throughout our region that's linked and vigorous. We undertook, as I think you will recall from our briefing in October last spring, what we called the DMV Hydrogen Greenprint. We believe that hydrogen was a great idea, again, as a contributor to the region's clean energy solutions. We wanted to test that, and so we brought on Accenture and did an in-depth data study in terms of could there really be a hydrogen market here? Can this be a viable solution and contribute to, the portfolio of clean energy solutions that this region is pursuing? In addition to answering yes to that question, it also identified some pretty significant benefits by 2030, and we actually think these are conservative. And again, this is just for the Washington MSA. If we were to include all of Maryland and all of Virginia, these numbers would go up. But in terms of both the environmental figures, the abatement of carbon, the reduction in the social costs of carbon, the increase to the region's GDP, and then, of course, the thousands of new jobs created. We're going to continue to test this and come up with even more refined numbers as we go through the proposal process, and we'll be back to report that to you. But we, again, think this is conservative. You can go and find the green print. If you're a data geek, you can really dive into the data around this. It's at connecteddmv.org/hydrogen. If you want just the summary, we've got that too. So great reading. Why our region is hydrogen ready? Well, we're strategically located. DOE has said, yes, this is a regional competition, but we want to create a national network. And so we actually started from square one, being collaborative with our neighbors to the north, west, and south in terms of the connectivity. But we believe our region, both strategically located with offshore wind, with the solar assets we've deployed, the very fact that the I-95 corridor runs through our region, I-81, and all of the other interstate ground transportation. Our airports, our ports throughout the region, and airports would, of course, be our major metro airports as well as our regional airports. Hydrogen aviation is going to be a reality, and we stand the chance to be the center of that, certainly for the United States, if not North America. And we have a marquee of off-takers. One of our projects is a federal facility. We're also looking at defense facilities. A lot of interest, as you can imagine, by our congressional delegations in that application, and they've been very supportive. So where we stand today, one of the required steps of the FOA process with DOE was that if you were interested in this funding, you needed to submit a concept paper, which we did in November. There were 79 other potential hubs from across the country that did that. DOE, shortly after Christmas, down-selected only 33 to encourage for a full application, and we, of course, were one of those 33. We actually think that number is going to come down because it's one thing to submit a 20-page concept paper. The full application is probably going to be 250 to 300 pages. And we've been at this for 2 years. A number of the other hubs that could be in that 33 really only started last spring, and so we have a head start in terms of the work that we've done. They've said, DOE has said 6 to 10 awards will be made to hubs. We think that's going to be on the larger side, probably 8 to 10. So at the end of the day, that could be up to $1 billion for our region, which would represent a 50% cost share for the portfolio of what we're trying to do. Our ask, of course, and thank you very much for the resolution, our other two asks would be, as we've been doing this work, we continually come across other projects that we didn't know about that are happening with clean hydrogen. So to the extent that you know of interested parties who are working on projects that we want to build into this ecosystem, we very much want to know. A crucial component of the DOE application is community benefits plans. That represents a pretty big chunk of this proposal, where we have to outline workforce, environmental justice, and particularly the Justice 40 directive from the Biden administration in terms of how we plan within our communities to make sure that the benefits are fully realized, but also that we have the relationships with community stakeholders to help sort of the risk prevention around community opposition. And so we've been developing those stakeholder relationships. We're continuing to build those out. But if there are other stakeholders that you would advise us to make sure we're connecting with that we may not have on our list, we would certainly be grateful for that. So with that,
great, thank you for that. Before we get into questions and conversation, we do have a resolution, so I'll ask if someone would move a motion to second this resolution. Okay. I think I have Councilmember Wolf moving, Vice Chair Lusk seconding, and this is a resolution to support your application moving forward so that a regional hub is located here in our region. So I think this is an excellent thing for us to be taking up today. Supervisor Briskman, and I think then I'm going to go to Vice Mayor Snyder and back here. Yeah.
Thank you. Pardon my ignorance, but what is a hub? Is that like a power plant? Is it going to be like a big facility like a power plant, and then wouldn't you have to go through some kind of local zoning to get it built in a certain place?
Do they take a lot of water? And how safe or unsafe are they?
That's a great question. The way DOE has described it, it's more conceptual, so it's not a physical location. This is a linkage of projects. So you could have a hydrogen production facility that's producing hydrogen through an electrolyzer connected to a data center that is looking to get off their backup hydrogen backup diesel generator. So the hub itself is conceptual in terms of the elements within the hub. So we'll have several production facilities throughout the region. We'll also have several offtake customers. And then we'll have the connective infrastructure, whether it's pipelines, whether it's actually putting it on a clean vehicle to get the hydrogen to the location. It's also proximate power, which could be, you could have a microgrid to serve, for example, a big data center cluster, where you actually put clean hydrogen power onto a microgrid to support that cluster. So we're going to come up and we'd love to share it with you. We'll have a conceptual map that shows across our region all those different elements.
So it could be like a bunch of dots around the region.
That are linked, yes.
Okay, so then you'd have to deal with a lot of jurisdictions to get them built. Okay,
correct.
Thank you.
And the safety and permitting and all of that also planning has to be shown in our proposal. So we are working on that as well in terms of how we're interacting with the government agencies.
Thank you.
Great. Vice Mayor Snyder?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Regrettably, we can't support this measure for two principal reasons. Number one, the environmental benefits have been overstated in the sense that a lot of hydrogen has to be produced by extensive amounts of fossil fuels. And perhaps even more importantly, hydrogen poses a public safety risk far greater than the fossil fuel situation that we're dealing with now. And we think that the public safety issues have been insufficiently prioritized and insufficiently addressed. So for those reasons, regrettably, we can't support this measure. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Snyder. Mr. Erskine, Mr. Solomon, would you like to respond at all? Or?
Yes, so we can actually produce carbon-free hydrogen using our vast solar and wind assets. It can also be produced by capturing the methane that's going to escape anyway from, say, a landfill. And there are ways to produce it. Basically, you need water to power an electrolyzer. And we have been working closely with those partners in terms of how to get to carbon-free hydrogen production. And then when you burn hydrogen, the only thing that's released is water.
Vice Chair Lusk.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'll just quickly say I appreciate the diversification that this would provide to our regional economy, so this is kind of interesting. Second, I would ask from an economic development standpoint in terms of the jobs and maybe salaries that might be associated with this opportunity, have you done any research and provide any data on that?
We have, and so our green print contains some of that, and the jobs cover the full spectrum from kind of entry-level workers all the way up through higher-end engineers. So it's a full breadth of diversified jobs. And again, in our report, I think you'll see upwards of 10,000 new jobs that were expected by 2030. If we took a more near-term approach on jobs, focusing on 2030, most of the other reports that you'll find nationally and beyond are focused on 2050.
Now, I'll just say I appreciate the opportunity, and I'd love, I think, Matt, maybe what I'll do is reach back to you and just have a follow-up conversation just to learn a little more of the details. So thank you very much.
And I think when we send the staff packet out again, I'd ask that you send the link to the October webinar that you did that went in depth on all of these things. All right. Seeing no other further questions or comments, I'll take the vote. All those in favor of the resolution, please say aye. 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 Any opposed? Any abstaining?
One abstention.
Abstain? All right, I have Supervisor Briskman, Chair Randall, and Vice Mayor Snyder abstaining. Did I get that correct? All right. I think the resolution passes then, and thank you very much, and we look forward to having you back. Good luck with your application to the Department of Energy, and we'll keep in touch. And with that, if there's no other business, anyone, yes. Supervisor
Madam
Briskman.
Chair, I know that we're trying to leave, but I just wanted to put in a plug for the, I think it's the February 17th event with the Anti-Defamation League and Meredith Weissel. I had the opportunity to give opening remarks at a Holocaust Remembrance Day at my library last week. She was one of the panelists, and I got a brief preview of what it will be in that presentation. I strongly recommend that my colleagues attend if they can. Thank you.
I very much appreciate that, Supervisor Briskman. And seeing no other business, we are adjourned. Thank you. All right.